I'm a data wonk, and we are told as economists, particularly as business economists, which is a little different from the academic community for whom scholarship is the primary focus of their efforts. In my case, I'm working primarily with the business community, and am asked on occasion to speak to professional and business organizations. That's sort of the limit of the scope of my contact with the real world these days. But in an earlier career, back when commercial banks back before the internet, when you sort of had to do your own economic research, you had to compile your own data. In particular, I was an economist at Bank of Hawaii, and eventually the chief economist at Bank of Hawaii in the day when the two big banks had economics departments, a long tradition that started after the Second World War, and played a role of sort of corporate citizenship in that, having produced economic information for our own use as commercial bank institutions, um, it didn't really cost us that much to disseminate information through published reports. And in fact, I remember when we got desktop publishing, um, there was a moment when Edward Enterprises, our publisher, and we had to cut ties because we didn't need to spend $250,000 on printing and publication expense. We, desktop published and then posted reports on our website. But that kind of evolution continues. Nonetheless, the content continues to be important. And I think we now live in an era where there's the challenge of misinformation and even disinformation, people actively seeking to use information to achieve political outcomes or undermine them, let's say, is a new confrontation. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know how to deal with it, but I find that it does complicate. There's a lot of signal loss when it comes, and I rely on journalists to help me to communicate, whether it's to the public at large or I think more specifically, people in decision-making roles, in management roles and in business and nonprofit organizations, advocates of various causes, and then the decision makers themselves in legislative and administrative positions. So there's a nexus. I at this late stage, entering a later stage of my life, I think I finally understand what what the network looks like, and so I want to use this opportunity to talk about something that's sort of mundane to actually go deeper. And I meant to show these. I'm not usually a bullet point person because I forget what I wrote in the bullet points. Um, and I was supposed to have these in the background while I was doing that introduction, because I hate when people read their bullet points. But so this is basically what I was starting to say in the introduction, that um, we have this ability in particular to visualize that really happened, after I got out of high school and college. Is sort of in that moment where personal computing came along and it became possible to actually do the graphics at home, right? DIY graphics. And and how you convey, and of course TV screens. We all sort of grew up in my generation as a way that information was being transmitted, right? The medium is the message. And and I'm a data wonk and a graphics nut. And so most of my slides will be wildly technical. And again, this is why I rely on journalists to help with the translation, because it's it's easy to bog down in the technical stuff if you're an economist. Um, and we enjoy it. Like, that's actually the thing we like to do. But you need the help to get across to people who need the information and maybe needn't be burdened with the technicality. So the trick is to get it out there without, you know, making them feel like they're uneducated. And I really, I mean, is the I rely on the interface of broadcast and print media and streaming, whatever content journalism to um, you know put the information out there. And so I actually did a little research and found these cool quotes on the internet. In the There's a part of economics that has to do with how you communicate economics. And in my professional association, this is like the number one thing they ask you to develop in your skill set. In our professional development courses, it's like the number one course you're supposed to take. I actually haven't taken it. I have the certification because I've taken all the other courses, but the reason I haven't is because um, I suspect a lot of it's going to come through from what I had to do when I was a bank economist. And at Bank of Hawaii, not once, not twice, but three times, I was sent to media training with Katie Lagaretta and Rick Zwern over Communications Pacific because I was such a screw up. So I'm still learning, and but I appreciate the fact that there's a way to do this, and that the people who are good at it, um, you know, know what the um, what would you call it, interlinkages are supposed to look at when they're really working well. And I just recommend, if you have any time next week, Jay Powell is going to give a press conference on Wednesday at about 8:30 Hawaii time. And if you've never watched Jay Powell's press conference after the meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the monetary policy decision making committee, and they're actually talking about streaming the committee meetings live now. I do recommend it only because the official statement is relatively brief, and he gets through that quite quickly. But to listen to what the best financial and economics reporters in the country, as far as I can tell, to listen to the nature and the arc of their questions, because it's dynamic, right? You don't ask a question that somebody's already asked and then had answered. It's a really interesting and educational experience if you only do it once, but certainly if you're a journalism student, I would check it out. So I'm going to talk about seasonality as a way to think about um, how to clean up data. And then we do this, okay? So you don't have to, but there's some things to watch out for. And then because it's relatively predictable, for example, that the unemployment rate goes up every June because people get out of school and they're all looking for work. Once you remove that predictable movement, you can get to underlying trends and whatnot in the data. And that's going to lead me to a more esoteric question about, what's equilibrium, or what's the steady state. I think a lot of people are stuck in a kind of a static notion of when things are good enough, or when we got as good as it's going to get. And I think in more dynamic terms. So we'll talk about that as well. So first of all, what's normal in the data? And that's a play on words, because if you remember, in a typical bell-shaped curve, a distribution of, say, the average height of adult males or adult females, which is slightly different, there'll be an average right at the center, and a tendency for the outliers to drape themselves um, uh, symmetrically on either side of the measures of central tendency, like the average or the median, right? The median where half is above and half is below. These are home price distributions, and I'm just going to use um, mostly Oahu, and I'm going to pick up Kona Kohala, so West Hawaii home prices, as a running example, just because I have the data. I worked on a project last month, and every year or so, these guys give me these great data sets. So on the left, you'll see the distribution of all single family plus condominium prices on Oahu for the last 30 years. So believe it or not, there are 30, it doesn't look like there's 30 of them there, but there are. And then on the right, you see the distributions for 4 annual periods. I start in the year beginning in April. I got this backwards. It's the 12 months from April through March, not March through April. So I start in April 2019 and in March 2020. Why? That's when the pandemic really hits. And then I go the 12 months after that, which is sort of after COVID starts, and then the year after that, which is after vaccination becomes available, and then the year after, and you can see that there's movement. What we typically talk about in terms of a normal price, like an average, doesn't work as well when you have a distribution that's skewed like this. And think of if you were taking an exam and the professor came to class after the exam and said, well, here's the distribution, and most of you guys are getting Fs, but there's a few people, the skewed distribution, which, by the way, in the case of home prices, looks like the distribution of income, looks like the distribution of wealth. So most of us live with moderate means and so on, and are moderately well-to-do. On the graph on the right, 1.0, that's $1 million. So most home prices, and those are single-family home prices now, are in the neighborhood of $1 million. And the median is like the midpoint is $1 million. Half are above and half are below. But it's not a symmetric distribution. And so just technically the average doesn't work. It turns out it does if you express these things in the prices in natural logarithms. So on the right side, I've got what's called a histogram, which you can see is symmetric. It's the log of prices. Okay, you didn't care. That's okay. It's only because I'm going to use logs. I'm never going to talk about it again. But that's how I look at prices. So it'll come up. I'll show you in a second. So here's the seasonality pattern for single family home prices on the Hilo side of the Big Island, on the left of the screen, and then the Kona Kohala side of the island on the right hand of the screen. And obviously it moves around, but you can see there's a systematic kind of a tendency, and that's especially strong in the Kona Kohala market, where almost always the peak month for prices in the course of the 4 quarters of the year, the peak quarter is the second quarter. And you might ask, well, why is that? I don't actually know. My suspicion is that West Hawaii, right, which has the resorts, it's Kona, right? It's a different kind of market from the Hilo side. The West Hawaii housing market is where a lot of people who come out in the winter, right, the snowbirds, come out in the winter, stay at a resort, and either intend in their decision to come to Kona or Kohala Coast, or in the course of their stay, decide to buy a condo or to buy a house. And so the prices are highest when those transactions close, which is in the April through June period. So it has something to do with winter, even though the prices show up in the spring. And that's because it takes a couple months for you to close on a sale if you're buying a house or selling a house. So then to extend this idea of, well, what's normal, I take out the seasonality, and then you get these nice smooth paths, little roller coaster paths. And these are Big Island prices, all of them in this case, for the single family market. And I can show you later if you want. The condos do the same thing. Although the condos on the Big Island are mostly resort condos. They're not like urban condos as in Honolulu. But you can see that roller coaster for Kona Kohala, which is at the top of this stack. And then I've broken out Hilo, as we did in the seasonal adjustment factor slide previously, and segregated the last tax map key, which is Ka'u. Ka'u, the prices in which look like Hilo, you can see they follow a very close trajectory, but they are more zigzaggy. And this is after seasonally adjusting Ka'u. Ka'u is just more noisy. And so if you're going to smoosh all of these markets together and talk about an average for the Big Island or a median for the Big Island, you'd be missing the fact that the west side of Hawaii is almost a completely different island in terms of the housing market. That from South Point, going counterclockwise around the Big Island to Hamakua side, right? The housing market has homes that, roughly speaking, are about half the price of the houses that are in tax map keys 5, 6, 7, and 8, which extends from Kohala down to South Kona. And we need to recognize that. And so when I work with Big Island realtor groups, I get this data set from their MLS provider, which is Hawaii Information Service, and props to them. They share their data with me for free on behalf of the realtor associations down there so that we can do the analytics. Now, there's a couple other things we're going to talk about, but notice you can already see a longer term trend in the data and obviously the cycle. And in particular, since COVID, right, since 2020, a new cycle that was really unexpected. And we'll maybe talk a little about that in a second. The seasonality for Kona, which I'm showing here, it turns out got messed up by COVID or maybe by the volcanic eruption. And so what I've done here is I've shown the data before the East Rift eruption in 2018 and the same data, including the East Rift. And you'll notice at the end where the pandemic starts, these seasonal variations pinch off. And there's something going on there. So I don't know what it is. And I'm trying to do my own fixes, and people are talking about how we do this. The pandemic was such a huge shock that it sort of messed up things. It's still reverberating, so to speak, in the data. And another example would be the shaded areas here are recessions. So in 2008, 2009, the Great Recession, you can see, created a little disturbance in the pattern in the early 20 teens, which then later disappeared. So these things happen. If you line up the seasonally adjusted data with the not seasonally adjusted data for Kona Kohala, it seems like they're really close, but actually the seasonally adjusted data, this was the variation, wasn't it? I can't read it. Yeah, this is the sales volume variation. They seem really close, but when you clean up the data, it allows you, for example, to interpret what's happening to sales volumes because of interest rates. So in this case, you're looking at sales volumes, which is the tail end of this series, right? The part that I haven't included the seasonally adjusted data in the illustration, the part since the East Rift eruption. These are my version of the seasonally adjusted, well, they're all my versions, but these are the ones I'm working with now. And then I've inverted the fixed rate mortgage rate, the average rate, on the right scale. So the red dashed line is actually the upside down mortgage rate to show how sales volumes and interest rates go together, albeit inversely. Why is this important? Well, the move from a 3% mortgage rate to a 7% mortgage rate in about a 2-year period, or less than that, 18 months, is the largest move in interest rates that we've seen in 40 years. So we're living, well, put it this way, half the population of Hawaii has never lived in a time when the mortgage rate increased by this much. And so to understand why sales volumes collapsed after that post-pandemic surge, right, you have to look at the interest rates. And the point I'm making here is only that if you take away the seasonality, you get more clarity on that. Now, when is this going to be a problem? It's mostly a problem when you're at a turning point, which is why I was sort of motivated talking with Jay a month or so ago by this previous experience with the Publishers Association. The presentation I was asked to make 15 years ago or 16, I don't know when, 2005 or 6. And you may recall, it was at that time, housing market was booming. We call it the subprime bubble now. We called it the subprime bubble then. And then the bubble collapsed and precipitated a financial crisis and the worst recession since the Great Depression. But the problem at the peak of that cycle was that a lot of people, and in particular, a lot of investors, a lot of people who were still buying houses, were convinced that there was nothing but upside. And what became really problematic was right at the peak of the cycle, you could see that home prices weren't really rising anymore, but the problem with seasonality was creeping in. So prices in the summer tend to be higher. If you're in a flat period for prices, prices in the summertime in that flat period are going to be higher than they are in the wintertime. And so people will be lured into thinking, wow, look at the high prices in June, when in fact they're not rising on trend anymore, or the cycle is actually turning in the other direction. And I've carefully enumerated the example in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here. The peak for volumes at that time was in the middle of 2004. And then a year later, 2005, sales were almost as high in the second quarter. Well, they're always high in the second quarter, but we know that, right? So we should take that into account. And if you do take that into account, had you been looking at the data at that time, it turns out the end of 2003 was the actual peak. So by the time you get into 2004, 2005, it just looks like it's peaking because of seasonality, but it's already peaked. And you're on the downslide and you don't know it. Now go back and read newspaper articles from that time. Because let's face it, a lot of them start with somebody's press release. And the people who write press releases, and I hung out with them at Bank of Hawaii, right? Their job is to make everything sound awesome. So that's their job. And I used to have arguments. I literally lived on the same floor as marketing. That was not an accident. They put economics on the same floor as marketing. And then we had to, we built a website together and wrote press releases together. The week before Lehman Brothers collapsed, I was having an argument. You guys know Stafford Kikuchi. I'm going to name names. This will get me in trouble. Stafford's one of the great communications professionals in this town. And our CEO at the time about the language of a press release, where I thought we were showing that we used to do a business confidence survey. This was the last survey we ever conducted. We never published it because we couldn't agree on the messaging. And I was out of a job 6 months later, to give you an idea of how that all worked out. But our executive management wanted the word strong in this press release, like something strong, like the economy is strong or business confidence is strong. And I was like, there's nothing strong about the collapse of the financial system. And, or words to that effect. And literally, Lehman collapsed that month and started the really intense part of the financial crisis. So people in different roles have different messages to convey, and conveying a message is really important. Don't rely on Jason Momoa to tell you where to travel on Maui, for example. We just learned that a month ago. And in this particular historical example, the cycle was done, but people were still writing press releases saying nothing but upside. And then I remember we reelected Governor Lingle on this idea in 2006 that the economy was just going gangbusters. And remember, Go Airlines started up, and Hawaiian Airlines and Aloha Airlines were duking it out anyway. And I'm sitting in these meetings. I just happened to be on a Bankers Association committee at the time, where I'd go to these meetings and we'd all be talking about the financial crisis. I mean, the incipient financial crisis and the implosion of the housing bubble. And then I'd cut back to and these were all bank economists, by the way, except for the Fed governors. And I'd come back to the office and have to, and bless his heart, Harvey Shapiro, the data guy at the Honolulu Board of Realtors. I remember arguing with him about this. Why? Because the Honolulu Board of Realtors does not seasonal adjust the data. Why should they, right? The data are the data. And I get this from reporters all the time. But this is what the Honolulu Board, right? Andrew Gomes wrote an article last month or earlier this month, about August home prices and August sales. And those are the data that the Honolulu Board of Realtors published. And you can go to their website and those are the data. It's the interpretation that's really important to remember, can be tainted, particularly at these turning points, if you're not removing patterns from the data that reveal what's going on underneath. So, long way of getting to a short point. Here's some more examples. These are seasonal adjustment factors for jobs in the upper left, and then retail jobs on the upper right. So every December, jobs go up, right? November, December, jobs go up by about 5 percentage points in retail, and by about a percentage point or two overall, because of the holiday shopping season. I actually worked at Liberty House one fall. I dropped out of school to surf, and I worked at Liberty House from October through December. They actually had a job that lasts from October to December, putting up Christmas decorations and stuff like that. Um, so also I could surf the fall surf season. The unemployment rate on the lower left. Now these are all on the same scale, which is why the unemployment rate's seasonal movement is so outsized. Every June, the unemployment rate jumps by a lot relative to the rest of the year because all these kids get out of school that didn't, you know, get an internship back in March. So now they're all looking for jobs. And so, right, the number of people out of work and looking for work goes up in June. And then they find a fast food job or something, and then it's all good. There are also patterns that go the other direction. So I have education. These are private education jobs on the lower right, where you can see the surveys are conducted in the first week of the month. So first week of January, right? People are on Christmas break. First week of August, people are still not back in school. But now that the school calendar's been, you know, moved up, they're about to go back to school, right? UH starts on August 21st, and I think public schools start August 6th, something like that. But okay, that's the pattern. And another example, so tourism is notorious for seasonal patterns. And here I've cleaned up hotel occupancy. Again, this is just the Wahoo data, but on the right side of the screen, you'll see pre-pandemic because the pandemic has busted up the numbers. And I don't know, I'm struggling to work with the data. I haven't talked to my UH colleagues about it. We're going to next month. But they're publishing seasonally adjusted data now that apparently they've figured out the magic formula. But you can see for the pre-pandemic data how taking the seasonality out reveals, you can see the cycle in the upper right-hand corner, but it cleans it up a lot. And then in particular, these shocks jump out. So the pandemic is an obvious shock, but 2001, you see there is 9/11, and then 1991, you'll see Operation Desert Storm, that kind of thing. And in fact, in the visitor arrivals data, these are statewide, the seasonally adjusted data uh, help you identify, as I have here, with some vertical lines, some of the notorious shocks to tourism. The pilot strike in 1985, Desert Storm 9/11, I mentioned, SARS in 2003, the shutdown of Aloha Airlines in 2008, that was a real thing. Um, and the seismic event in Japan. And then, of course, the mother of all exogenous shocks, COVID-19. Now, I actually have tourism data back to about 1922, which unfortunately is after the last global pandemic. And but I imagine you'd see it in those data. Seasonality also evolves. So I just want to make this point briefly. Um, we've got now 50 years of data or so. These are monthly data, and the seasonal adjustment factors for arrivals. You can see how March, I've traced the mini peaks that are the March interim peaks. Summertime is always the peak. August and now July. Why? Because the school calendars changed. So school starts in August, not in September. So people have to vacation in July rather than August. And fall, back in the day, November being the low month, but more recently, September is the low month of the year. Fall has always been a challenge, and in fact, I even have it down here at the base of my desk. Oh, this is the wrong report, but I have these reports from the 1930s that talk about how we need to make Aloha Week successful to bring more visitors to Hawaii during the shoulder season. March is interesting because spring break wasn't a thing until Gidget came to Hawaii. So now I'm talking about my generation, right? The boomers made spring break a thing. Before 1970, March was just like any other month. In fact, even less important month for visitor arrivals prior to the 1970s. But once the boomers took over, it became a huge thing. So it's subsided somewhat, but both March and December have become more important months than they were, say, 40 or 50 years ago. And you're going to see this in the so a good example is thinking about the Maui catastrophe, the Lahaina wildfire, people sent the wrong message initially, which was, don't go to Maui. And it's like, wait, don't go to West Maui because Wailea is still open. But okay, they got that message screwed up. But August is a really important month. It's not as important as July, but August is a really important month. September is the weakest month. So it doesn't matter that the governor said, oh, wait, we meant West Maui, not all of Maui. Too late, brother. It doesn't matter. Nobody comes in September. And September, October, November are the three worst months of the year over there as well. Um, so we now have DBED and UHERO publishing official data you can download from their websites, and I've got the link here in the footnotes, as is true with most of these data. The skinny line is the DBED data, and you can see they're saying that for the last year or so, visitor counts have stabilized in this post-pandemic period. I have my own method. It doesn't look as clean as theirs. Let's go one step beyond here and talk about trends and cycles a little more deeply. So here I'm looking at home building values. Okay, so there's a housing unit that's built, and then there's the cost of building that unit, right, which is not the same thing. So for example, if you increase, if you make additional regulatory impositions, right, hurricane windows or mandatory photovoltaic panel installation, if you increase the cost of building the housing unit, it just makes it more expensive. It doesn't get you another unit. But these are the dollar amounts associated with the cost of building a structure that's getting a building permit on Oahu for the last 50 years or so. And I mean, and you can see this, the recessions of the gray areas. A lot of people think, and now, people writing in Building Industry magazine, right, are attentive to what's going on with the US business cycle, what's happening with interest rates, and all the stuff that is the sort of stuff of macroeconomic concern. Is there going to be a recession, blah, blah, blah. But as it turns out, there are deeper movements in these data that you can actually, if you just look at it for a second, just eyeball it, you can see a cycle there that doesn't have anything to do with recessions at all. Recessions come and go with some irregularity. They tend to come less frequently, right? We figured out how to manage the economy. So instead of every 4 years or instead of every 8 years, they're coming. I mean, the last expansion was longer than 10 years. The expansion of the 1990s was 10 years. I think the 80s expansion was almost 10 years. So, okay, we figured out how to, poor George W. got cut off by the financial crisis, but we could be at the front end of an expansion that carries us all the way through the 2020s. I mean, it could be that, tranquil, so to speak, and yet you can clearly see a cycle. And so here I've done the math to decompose them, and I was a little surprised to find there's more than one cycle. And so let me describe what you're looking at here. This picture, building permit values adjusted for construction cost inflation. So these are constant dollars or real construction costs. So we compare them, you can compare today's cost to the cost 50 years ago in a straightforward way. So take this picture and then decompose it. It's in the upper left-hand corner now, and decompose it into these underlying constituents plus a noise element I'll come back to. And you can really see, that is to say, this plus the cycles plus the trend equals the blue zigzaggy line in the upper left-hand corner. Miraculous, isn't it? It's like mathematically, they literally are additive. This noisy series, it averages 0, so it's mostly noise, plus the cycles that I've extracted in this trend. Now you can start, again, if you're building industry digest or building industry whatever, and you need to be thinking about what's up with that trend in the 2020s, which is going downwards. And what's up with these cycles? Because all of them point to less construction, less home building on Oahu in the 2020s. Didn't the governor just declare an emergency? Maybe this is why he declared an emergency. I mean, maybe people are picking up not having seen the data, because how could they? I just did this the other day. I did this on Thursday last week. Um, Picking up that there's, things are moving in the wrong direction, and we need to get Nani Medeiros on the job, except she got so much BS that she quit. That's how scary a job it is. Um, I just want to make the comment, you can see the recessions do show up in this noise component, which is kind of interesting, that the business cycle, the US business cycle actually lurks in the noise. That is to say, these waves in the upper right, the Japan bubble, the subprime bubble, the new urbanism of the 20 teens, we're going to build new condos, gleaming condos. And the original wave, the one Jay and I were riding when we were growing up in Hawaii, the Catch-A-Wave, after Tom Kaufman's famous book, the Catch-A-Wave wave, which was sort of, you can build whatever you want in Hawaii back in the day. Those waves are combined with a longer term super cycle that's like 30 years in duration. I mean, what is that? Peak to peak, that's like 40 years. That's a 40-year cycle. So that's an intergenerational cycle, if you will. Or you could think of it as the boomers and then the boomers' kids, the millennials, or I don't know how to think of it, but there's something there. And just to be clear, I'm going to show you the Big Island data just for the housing units, not the values, the actual numbers of housing units, which DBED publishes, and the data are there. Again, I'm extracting, in this case, only three components. The cycle appearing in the waves we just talked about, a noise component at the bottom right, but then also on the Big Island, as on Oahu, a downward trend that should be of concern for anybody. But you can just see that on the Big Island now, they build 1/4 the number of housing units they did at the peak of the last two cycles, the Japan's cycle and the subprime cycle. So you can make what you will of that. To conclude then on this sort of nerd fest, questions about what is the trend and equilibrium? That is, should we count on a trend or should we count on like a level? And my attitude is no, the dynamic equilibrium is the one you should be thinking about. So let's go back to home prices. We started there. Here's Kona Kohala, Hilo, and Ka'u, and then I've added Oahu as you would see it in levels. So when people say, whoa, $1 million, that's 1,000 here. These are in thousands of dollars. $1 million for a house in Kona on average, or the median, and the normal house in Kona or the normal house on Oahu is like $1 million, $1 million. And you say, okay, well, you hear a lot of people say this. Oh, that's too high. And I'm thinking, no, bro, that's not the metric by which you should be thinking about these things. The metric, the equilibrium you should be thinking about is the path, not the level. The path, which if this is in levels, right? Now these are logs, and I told you I was going to bring it back. We already saw this picture, so don't tell me you don't understand, because this is the log of these home prices. I've just put the scale in, so it's still 1 million, right? 1,000 is 1 million. 1,000 is a million. It's the path that's the equilibrium, the trajectory of, say, 5% home price appreciation since the early 80s. And you have to imagine this for Kona, which I've drawn in there. But after the great inflation of the 1960s and 70s, after monetary policymakers figured out how to tamp down inflation, and now they have an explicit goal of 2% inflation, we've lived now in about a 30 or 40-year interval with about 2% inflation and about 5% home price appreciation, those underlying trends, which means that in real terms, adjusted for inflation, right, you get 3% appreciation as an investor. You get 3% appreciation after inflation, which is 2%, so 3 plus 2 is 5, plus a dividend, right? Your total return is the capital gain appreciation plus the dividend. What's the dividend? The dividend is you get to live in your house, like you rent it from yourself. Or if you're a landlord, you charge rent, and that's the dividend, right? The cash flow, in addition to the appreciation. And if you're thinking the way I am, here, then the only thing that's distinctive about a $1 million home price on the Kona Kohala side of the Big Island and on Oahu right now is that they're premature in some sense. It's premature to have gotten there in Kona Kohala, that there's something going on there, and I could show you on Maui and elsewhere. It's also happening on Oahu, but not with the extent of the vigor in West Hawaii. And then West Hawaii in general has a cycle of larger amplitude. So it always has a roller coaster ride that's more volatile than the roller coaster ride on Oahu. But that path means that it would have gotten there on the Big Island by the late 2020s, right? Kona Kohala prices would have gotten to $1 million in the late 2020s anyway, if the equilibrium path, around which it does vary, but if the equilibrium path held, which I think it does in the long term, and it's because of arbitrage and a bunch of financial blah, 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 it doesn't matter. I'm just telling you, you can't think in terms of a dollar price, you have being the equilibrium. You have to think in terms of the whole trajectory. And here I've done the illustration for Kauai, for Maui, Kona Kohala again, and Oahu again. These are median single family prices. And the appreciation rates are slightly higher on the neighbor islands. I'll put them back together with Oahu. And you can kind of see that here. So in this historical era, since the 1980s, let's say, the neighbor islands have had a more robust trajectory. So they were kind of the frontier, if you will, for economic and housing development of the last generation or two, right? Since Jimi Hendrix's Rainbow Bridge concert in upcountry Maui in 1970, right? These neighbor island economies have been somewhat more robust, and that shows up in these higher rates of appreciation. You see similar rates of increase. These are uh, average daily hotel room rates on Maui and Kauai, right? So 4, 5%, slightly different look. Kauai went through a period pre-Iniki where it was shifting upwards, and then after the Great Recession, it shifted back. It's now shifted upward again. And then this interim period after Iniki, this is really about timeshare conversion, and we could do securitization. We could talk about that another time. But the point here is the rate of appreciation is almost the same as what you see with home prices here. So what I'm saying is that that's not an accident and expect it to continue. And while we're at it, West Hawaii is the western edge of Orange County, California, or at least San Diego, which you can see in recent years has tracked almost dollar for dollar in terms of home prices. There are other things happening in California, particularly with respect to tech industry development, that have made that a more robust housing market. But here's an example of Honolulu and Boulder, Colorado, which has a completely different cycle over time, but in the long run has exactly the same appreciation. And by the way, is experiencing simultaneously this post-pandemic surge, which I think has to do with remote work and working from home. We're sorting that out. One final example, I know a lot of people move to Las Vegas, but that's a gamble. They're in Las Vegas now, which is cheap. So this is an index. This is not the actual level of prices. If I start the clock ticking in 2022 and work backwards, what this shows is that adjusted for inflation, taking out the 2 or 2.5% inflation, Honolulu's had this 2.3% you see there, plus the 2 to 2.5% inflation to give you a 4.5 or 5% nominal return. But let's call it 2.5% real return. Oahu's had a real return that Vegas has not. Vegas has had a much more volatile experience, a huge subprime bubble experience, and then a massive implosion after the subprime bubble. So people who tell you they made a lot of money in Vegas on housing are the people who bought in Vegas in 2012. But, you know, easy come, easy go, right? It's Vegas. And then they're going to run out of water. So let me pull it together and then take some of your questions. I've become this PowerPoint junkie because visualizing the data is a way of telling a story. Now, it tends to be excessively technical for a broader audience, and so I rely on media professionals to do the translation. It's a difficult task because we're living in this world of Chinese, TikTok disinformation and Russian disinformation and so on. Not to mention the domestic, uh, QAnon type, whatever is going on there. But we're sort of trapped in a world where a lot of the so I give an example here from the Constitution. The Constitution of Hawaii um, commands us. We shall, right? The verb is shall, not may. The state shall do this. The state shall do that. The state shall act in a manner consistent with furtherance of the self-sufficiency of the state. And so, just conceptually, self-sufficiency is the economic development strategy of North Korea, and that's in our Constitution. So when I come along and I say, no, it's growth is the equilibrium, you can see there's a problem, a contradiction that has to be resolved. Personally, I think the Constitution got it wrong, but I wasn't there. I was off studying on the mainland when they rewrote it. Um, so we've gone pretty far down the rabbit hole in terms of dynamic equilibrium as a way to think about the reference point, like what ought to be happening. Having started up just talking about seasonality, but you'll see right away when you start thinking about this how much of what we try to achieve in Hawaii in terms of the political culture has to do with goals that are disconnected from dynamic equilibria. And I've got a short list of them there. Um, and I've written a lot recently, last few years. I don't know if you've been checking the Uhiro website, but my 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 sensei and a very generous Jim Mack, who's my thesis advisor, and Frank Haas, who's a marketing person. I'm sure a lot of you know, a former tourism authority guy, have been writing about over tourism, which is sort of the topic du jour, and which people are using as an excuse to constrain tourism, right? There are too many tourists. That the word over tourism implies there's too many of them. When in fact, the whole thing could continue growing if we just managed it. Or at least that's my argument. And my example case study is Disneyland. But I just conclude with these couple observations that I'm not going to win many of these battles, obviously, in the political spectrum, but I do rely on journalists and the professionals out there to help communicate what are really difficult ideas um, that might change the direction we're going.